Ash is the VP of Strategic Expansion and Technology for Treehouse Ministries. Treehouse is a organization based in the Twin Cities of Minnesota that their tagline is ending hopelessness among teens. And I just love that. I think we are all aligned with that mission. They help churches create safe spaces for teens struggling with mental health through a support group model. I spent many years in ministry in the Twin Cities and had kids involved in these support groups, and they are just life-changing. And so I'm so excited that Ash is here today to share with us how we can make our ministries a safe space for these teens as well. So Ash, I will let you take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Let me start first with a brief apology, which is never a great way to start anything, but one of the little petri dishes that live in my home that some people call children have gotten me sick. And so I will probably be taking several frequent sips of my water to keep myself from coughing. But we will get through together. So I'll start with a story, but first, just a little bit on my posture for these kinds of trainings. We will go through talking about the church, talking about some of the ways that we can improve on creating a space where kids can open up that's safe for kids who are struggling with mental health. But there can be a bit of a perception and reality that folks who work in nonprofits or parachurch ministries are against or have something against the local church because we don't work in the local church. We work in a different Christian context. And so just so you know, that is not at all Treehouse's posture. We love the church. We think the church is God's solution for the world. And we love to come alongside and help support and help you do ministry really well to kids who are struggling. So let me start with this story. So picture, if you will, a young man who is in 5th grade. He is handsome, he is tall, maybe abnormally tall, and he is a baseball star. He is athletic, and he is known as the kid who you want on your baseball team because he can run really fast and hit the ball really far. Now picture him getting the news that he is growing too quickly, that his mom's tall jeans have gone a little overboard and his muscles and tendons cannot keep up. So he needs a surgery to lengthen the tendons in his feet and ankles so that he can continue to walk, because otherwise his bones will break from the tension of the tendons. This young man has the surgery, which results in him needing to be in a wheelchair for a period of time for the recovery. During that period of time, he is no longer able to play baseball. And as he becomes more sedentary, he begins to gain weight and become less active. The result being he starts to get bullied at school, and he does from 5th grade to 6th grade a social swing from being the cool kid to being the bullied and picked on kid. Fast forward into his high school years, his mental health since that point has declined and declined and declined and declined. He is now using drugs as a way to cope with the pain that he has. He has been diagnosed with severe social anxiety. And one of the ways he tries to cope with all of this pain and confusion is by cutting himself. And so he ends up with rows and rows and rows of scars on his arms, mixed in with new, fresh cuts. Then one day, when he is in high school, He and his mom decide to go to church. They want to find hope. They want to see maybe this is a place where I can get some help. So as they sit down and the music is going, one of the ushers comes over, taps them on the shoulder, excuse me, and asks them to leave, referencing the scars on his arms as an indication why he's not welcome in that church space. And so they do. And to my knowledge, he has never entered a church building again. He's now approaching 30 years old. He has come a tremendously long way from a healing perspective, emotionally, but still very resistant to anything spiritual, largely based on that one experience. So, a couple things about that story. One is, I am not going to judge that whole church or the whole church in general by that one experience. That was one usher who may have gotten into his or her head that there is something demonic about self-harm, because that was kind of a way of thinking a little while ago, and maybe thinking he or she was doing a good thing by getting this out of their church. So I don't know anything about the church's posture, except for this. I would venture a guess that they were not intentional about creating safe places for people who are struggling. Had they been, I think that usher probably would not have felt empowered or misinformed in a way to ask this young man to leave their church service. So that's our goal today, is to create a bit of a roadmap for how to create some safe places for teens to belong in a youth ministry. We'll go through some statistics on the front end. We're going to have some interaction. So please feel free to come off your mic when I have questions on the screen so that you can share and we can have some dialogue. And then we'll transition into 9 questions you can ask yourself for, are you creating a safe place for teens? There can be a bit of a misconception about mental health in the church. And that is this, that things to help with mental health and to create safe places for mental health need to sound really mental healthy. They need to sound like something that would come out of a therapist's mouth. The reality is a lot of ministry skills actually give us the ability to create safe places for any teens, including those who struggle with mental health. And so this isn't, you probably, as we go through these questions, you may be surprised that there's not a lot of mental health kind of language here, but the goal is to create a posture and a space where anybody can belong, and belong pretty quickly, regardless of what it is that they struggle with. All right. You are undoubtedly aware that we are in the middle of a teen mental health crisis. And so we track this number, as Rebecca said, Treehouse's mission is to end hopelessness among teens. And so we track the hopelessness. This is like a hopelessness gauge by the CDC for how teens are doing. Prior to the pandemic, this was in, I think, 31%. Post-pandemic, this has now gone up to 44%. And this is from 2021. The CDC is kind of slow with getting data out. And so we will get an updated number for this pretty soon, but we're approaching 50% of teens who are feeling persistently sad or hopeless over the last 12 months, which isn't good. When you think about death by suicide for children ages 10 to 14, suicide is the number two cause of death. And for teens 15 to 24, it's the number 3 cause of death. this is sometimes suicide can feel very mental health oriented, and of course it is, but it does have to do a lot with the environment and the world that's going on around people. And this is one of the things that is just struck me. I was updating this slide deck recently and just making sure all my statistics were accurate still. And suicide actually dropped on the ages 15 to 24 side, only to be replaced by homicide, which is just, I mean, when you think about that age group, it's just horrible to think the circumstances that some kids are living in, and the outcomes of those circumstances, and how that can affect hopelessness and mental health. And then suicide attempts. 13% or 13 out of every 100 females have attempted suicide in the last year. High school age females, this is for high school age. And then 6.5% on the male side. That has gone significantly up over the last several years. So now let's transition. So that's kind of laying out a bit of the problem, which I think we're all aware of, is kids are struggling. But also, when we think about creating a safe space, that's often not defined and often not done very well, if I'm really honest. There are a lot of really well-meaning people who want to create a safe place for teens. Heart is in the right place, but then they just don't always know how to do it consistently and do it really well. So feel free, let's come off mics if you're willing, and just say, when you hear the words safe space, what is it that comes to mind for you?
Where one person can be themselves, like any person can be authentically who they are.
Yeah.
A space where someone can feel no fear of being shamed.
A place where they know they can go to someone for help.
Hmm. Yeah, those are great. Because the term safe place has gotten, it's buzzword-ish, and when any time something becomes buzzword-ish, we end up with multiple definitions of the same word, and then we're talking past each other rather than having shared meaning of what it is we're talking about. So this is how I just kind of quickly break out what a safe place is and what a safe place isn't. There's probably more things than this, but I think this helps create a bit of a framework. A safe place is a place where difference of opinion is okay. You actually don't have to ascribe fully to somebody else's opinion in order to belong. But it is not a place where every opinion is deemed correct. It's like where it's okay that you have differences of opinion, but you don't have to affirm other people's opinions about everything. A place to come as you are is safe. A place to stay as you are is not safe. And this is something that I think it can be easy as you're getting into this mindset where people go wrong a little bit, is where you want people to feel very loved and cared for, which is perfect. But we forget that they're actually not in a good place right now, and it's not safe for them to remain there. And so helping people to grow is part of creating a safe place. It is a place where shaming is not acceptable. And then a safe place is not where shaming is the norm. A safe place is where you belong right away. And a safe place is not where you have to earn belonging. This is a place that, or this is a one that I've known or seen churches struggle with maybe the most out of all of these, because church every like church in general, and then individual churches and individual denominations have a culture. And when you enter into a culture, there are unspoken rules about what you need to do to operate within that culture. And so when somebody is coming from outside the church to inside the church, they don't know those rules yet, but everybody else does. And it creates a sense of not belonging. Whereas, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but it is actually really helpful to identify your church culture's expectations and then speak them out loud. So people actually know the rules that they're walking into so that they can belong. And I'm not going to say what those rules need to be, but it's just really helpful so that you have shared understanding. And then a safe place is a place where you can speak without fear of gossip. And then a safe place is not a space where your stuff gets spread around. I'm going to jump through a few scripture verses here. When we think about safety in scripture, I know safety is emotional safety is a relatively modern concept, but I do think it has a lot of roots in scripture. When I think of therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for each other so that you may be healed, that requires a level of safety so that you can actually get support from one another for things you're struggling with. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Carrying someone's burdens is not judging someone's burdens or pushing them away because they have a burden, but it is coming alongside and carrying them together, which is a form of safety. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other as the Lord forgave you. So you're not holding these things against each other, but you're welcoming people in even when they mess up. And I believe this is the last one. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. I love the parallel where it's not just encouraging. Encouraging can be a little soft. It's like that's the cheerleading part, but building one another up is that challenge part of like let's make progress together. Let's heal together, and those things go together to create safety. All right, so now this is like the harder part. And so we're going to talk about the perception of the church from teens. So people who are teenagers who are outside of the church, how they perceive the church. 87%, and this is from Unchristian by David Kinnaman, which is aging. But I think these numbers actually would have gotten worse rather than better over the last 10 or so years since that book was written. 87% perceive the church to be judgmental, 70% insensitive to others, 82% out of touch with reality, and 85% hypocritical. I love David Kinnaman's posture in the Unchristian book because it is very grace-filled in that he suggests this actually isn't necessarily reality, but it is the perception of reality rather than necessarily what Christians are or want to be. So here's my question to you. In your opinion, why does this perception matter? Why do we care about the perception? Shouldn't it just be, are we doing it right?
People won't come to church if they feel like they're going to already be judged and not accepted, so they won't even walk in the doors.
Mm-hmm.
It matters to know what other people are thinking, so also you know what to work on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perception or not, it's their reality, right? So we may
Yeah.
not realize their reality, so we have to be willing to look in the mirror.
Yeah.
I think we also have to own that in many ways the church has earned that perception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk a little bit now about the results of that perception. Because there is the unchristian book is about people outside the church viewing the church as I was like the church kid. Like if you think of a kid in your ministry that's like the church kid that's at everything, that um is like on the student leadership team and goes on all the trips and everything, that was totally me. I was like as in the church culture as you could get. um and some of this actually was in my mind as well. Some of this perception, even from inside the church. This is just something to think about. We won't do the discussion thing on this one, but do you think teens in your church feel known by their youth staff and volunteers? So just think about that for a second. Do they, from their perspective, feel like, man, these people get me, or they know the real me? So this is from Kara Powell and Brad Griffin's Sticky Faith Youth Worker Edition. There is a lot of great data in there. Again, it's starting to age, but I would not guess that this has changed much since the book was written and the research was done. Only, according to their research, 5% of students felt that my youth leader really knew me, meaning that 95% were presenting a version of themselves to their youth leaders that was inaccurate, or they were holding something back, or they were just on the fringes and they didn't even really have a relationship at church, which is totally possible as well. I would say, as kind of the quintessential youth group kid growing up, this was totally me. I had like a really well-honed persona that I put forward, and that persona is what was being discipled. And I was holding a lot back. The cool thing is that eventually God kind of cracked that persona for me, and I did start being more authentic with my youth leaders. And I was met with love and grace and care, rather than any kind of the judgment that I perceived might happen. That I was that fear of shame and that fear of rejection that was keeping me kind of balled up inside and presenting a shinier version of myself than was real. Also from Sticky Faith, when they asked teens, what do you want more out of you in your youth group? They want more time for deep conversations. When you look at this list, this is like kind of the intense stuff of youth ministry, or the less fun stuff. This is not pizza parties and um, outings. This is the service. This is deep conversations. This is deep relationships with adults and accountability. They are actually craving that safety and that safe place to be themselves, but there's a barrier there that is preventing from that from happening. This is from a study done by Barna and Youth Specialties on the state of youth ministry. This was done pre-COVID. I would venture to guess this is a little higher now, but I don't have updated data on that. But at the time, 10% of youth ministers felt that a safe and nurturing environment is an important goal. Only 10%. And so I think we have, at least at the time, we have a long way to go when we think about this topic of creating a safe place for teens who are struggling. I do think that is coming more into the consciousness of people, which is great. But because that has not been a part of church culture for a long time, we don't necessarily have a good roadmap on how to get there. And then kind of the other end of the spectrum, 75% of youth pastors say that discipleship and spiritual instruction is one of their highest priorities. So you have a bit of a disconnect there. And here is my thesis before we jump into the 9 questions for assessing a safe culture. In order to see that spiritual change and discipleship that you want, we must actually create a safe culture in which teens can struggle with mental health or whatever, and ask questions without a fear of rejection. And again, perception is reality. And so we're starting from a deficit where we actually have to undo the perception. And then we have the opportunity to make some progress, but we're actually starting from a deficit here. So we have some work to do. I won't jump into this for sake of time, but again, just think through what are the things that keep students from opening up, and we've talked about this a little bit of shame, fear of rejection, fear of judgment. Sometimes there are family and cultural pieces to this as well, where it may be shameful or inappropriate from a cultural perspective to share what's really going on. And then also in a church context, students may be required to manage their family's image, not just their own image, because if their parents are also part of the church, if they feel like if they are honest about the things that they're struggling with, it'll reflect poorly on their parents. So there are a lot of things that can keep students from opening up, but we can do what we can to make some progress. All right, so now we will jump through 9 questions to assess the safety of your culture. And the first is, which seems really obvious, but do you talk about safety and confidentiality? We sometimes can get a little weird about stuff where we think we have to make these kind of subtle changes, or we have to kind of come up with some formula to make these changes, to make growth in this area of safety. But it really starts with vision casting for your students. It starts with saying like, hey, we actually want this to be a safe place. And part of that is inviting your whole group into the concept of confidentiality. That starts to alleviate some of that anxiety about your stuff getting around, that fear that if they say something here, it's going to get to the senior pastor and it's going to get to their parents. Of course, with confidentiality comes, we have to navigate the mandated reporting side of confidentiality. But as a group, can you agree together that this is not a gossipy group, that we're actually going to be honest with each other and it's not going to get out from there? The next question is, do you hold everyone accountable? And this is one of the things that can feel a little counterintuitive. But if we're going to have a safe place for teens, everybody actually has to be on board with that. The number one way in which you lose safety, or one of the number one ways in which you lose safety, is from their peers. Excuse me. And so do you have some set expectations, especially around gossip and confidentiality, in which there is a consequence of some sort, and that it would have to be, different in different contexts, or when somebody steps out of that and does not create a safe place? Or if somebody is shaming somebody else or being a bully to somebody else, does that it get addressed, and does that person, or do you have the opportunity to address that? Marta, I see a raised hand, and I apologize, I can't see the chat in my share mode, so feel free to come off and interrupt me. That's totally fine if you have something to ask, but go ahead, Marta.
I was just wondering if we could pause here a little bit and maybe like brainstorm suggested scripts or lines that we could have in
Yeah.
our heads, both for when the recipient of what we're gonna say is a young person and also older people. So I have the bigger challenge redirecting some of
Mm.
our seniors in the church when I overhear some of what they're talking about. And it's not necessarily a good example for our youth, and youth are
Mhm.
in that shared space. So, yeah, I would love some advice on this part.
Yeah, so not working in a church context and primarily being focused on youth, I'm curious if any of the others have any thoughts on how to address that. I one thing I might say is there I would imagine have to be an education piece of the value of what you're trying to create for the teens and casting that vision, that so you have a framework to address those issues. But yeah, totally curious what others might have to say on this.
Yeah, I would just say as the pastor at a small church, if that was here, any of my staff or any other, member that encountered that, I would hope I foster an environment where they would come to me so I can have a chat with my older members. I've also had chats with our youth when they have overheard older members, just to say, this is not okay. This is not who we are. One came up recently. We were talking baseball, and one of my old war vets couldn't believe there was a Jap playing in Major League Baseball. And I went, you realize we're allies now. Like, yeah, but they have their own league. And I was like, holy moly, Newsmax, man. Yeah, what, and had to say, well, then it's to voice almost that difference of opinion, safe space kind of, and model that for the kid that was part of this conversation and go, well, I, for one, love Shohei Ohtani, and I am so glad and I enjoy watching him play.
Yeah.
So, but I would hope that if you, like for Marta, if you didn't feel comfortable in some ways having that conversation, coming to me so that I can have that conversation, because I know that those folks love the youth in our church. And then I can go to them and say, hey, here's what we're modeling for our youth. Here's what they're hearing. And I don't even care if you think you're right.
Yeah.
So I think
It's
I'm gonna
about,
have to step up my game, to be honest with you, only because we're gonna enter an interim pastor situation shortly
Ooh.
with Pastor Cliff's retirement. And so I think I'm just gonna have to be much more bold about addressing the elder members of our church.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I appreciate it, Pastor
Yeah.
Ed.
Those
Yeah.
are great questions.
It's helpful for me in these kind of situations to understand my role as a protector of them and a protector of the culture that we're creating, because that gives me more boldness, because it's not just like, oh, I have to go tell this person that was inappropriate, but it's a defense of what God's doing. And if I just kind of let that go, then it puts this at risk. And so a couple tricks are assuming the best and just saying, I know you love these kids and I love these kids, and kind of spinning it positive. A lot of times it's misunderstanding too. Like Ash's opening story, like they didn't understand why a kid would be self-harming. And so to say, hey, sometimes this is what this means, and here's how you can just between you and God be praying for this, for our students in general, and not sharing any information about specific kids. But if you want to pray for this mission trip coming up, if you want to pray for this, we would love to have you supporting us in that way. And then it pulls them onto your team, which makes them feel really weird when they want to talk about students, which I love that. Of like, no, you're on our side now. You can't go do that.
Those are great tips, Rebecca. All right, let's keep rolling for the sake of time. We just talked about this a little bit, but what you can just think, we don't have time for the discussion, but what might be the barriers in your context consequences or follow through. And I will just call out a couple things, and this does take a lot to work through. Especially younger people who are just in youth ministry can kind of forget that parents are a big deal. We have to have relationships with parents, but I have seen this where the youth worker is trying to create this safe place and trying to give some time off to kids or trying to adjust their attitude around youth group. And their parents are like really not on board with that. And they think their child is like a perfect angel. And so I would say one of the things here is just like parents can be challenging in this, or they can be like your biggest ally. So just be friends with parents as early as possible. Do you model vulnerability? It can be easy for us to just deal with our own shame around our own stuff. And so we can put on a front for the kids that we're perfect, that we're shiny and all good. And so the question is, or the instruction here is, it's okay to open up about past struggles and shame. It can be tempting to go too current, and in which case you end up with an inappropriate scenario where like the students are your support system, which is not like the ideal thing. But open up, be as open and vulnerable as you can. Our insecurity is the enemy. If we're trying to fashion an image for the students, that we will have a really, really hard time creating a safe place for them. And then a lot of this happens top down, even though you need buy-in from all the students. The place to start is in your staff meetings, or with your volunteers, is to create vulnerability and safety there so that everybody can feel this and catch the vision for how great it'll be as it spreads throughout the ministry. Do your volunteers add to the safety of your culture? And this is potentially getting a little bit to what Marta was asking, is sometimes the other adults in the room create a risk to the safety. So that starts in some ways, again, with the leadership team of casting that vision. This is what we're creating together. And then care for your volunteers how you want them to care for teens. Create that vulnerability and openness and that grace-filled space for your volunteers to model then what it is that you're doing on a larger scale with the teens. And then just be available to coach, kind of like Rebecca was saying, is, hey, this is what we're trying to create here. And we want to protect that. And so I'm assuming the best, like, I know you want this too. So we need to make some adjustments so that we can create this for the teens. All right, next, and I apologize for all the coughing. Do your student leaders create safety for their peers? And so I know, like, youth ministries are all different sizes. So sometimes you have like a larger youth ministry and you have a formal like student leadership team that like helps you plan events and gets discipled by the leaders or whatever. But this also, or maybe even more importantly, is like those power kids. It's the kids in the space that pull social weight. Even if it's not positional. And I think one of the more humbling things about working with teens is recognizing that those kids actually have like way more power in the room than we do. And so identifying like who are those kids with pull and influence, and how can you engage them onto your team? How can you pass the vision for them? For this is how we do this. We don't bully here. We don't put kids down. We don't judge if somebody is struggling with depression, and get them to see that vision and to build that into them, rather than having them be your enemy from the creating safety perspective. And just help them see like the primary job is to care for their peers. Like they have a job in this space and they can be really powerful at that. You can also assign kids to engage newbies. And I know a lot of youth ministries already do this, but if they're just handpick a few teens in your ministry and give them some training of like, hey, if a new kid comes in the door, it's your job to sit with them. It's your job to engage them. It's your job to introduce yourself and make them feel welcomed. That can go a long way in setting your culture, because now everybody is thinking in this way of like, how are we engaging people and helping them feel welcome, helping them feel safe? Because you're just getting more and more people on your team to create this culture. And this is another one. This is a bit of a nod to what we do at Treehouse. So we do a support group program, and we train churches to do a support group program that's a safe place for teens from in the church and in the community to come and talk about life. But this does not have to be just a Treehouse support group. And that is, do you create a safe place for teens to talk about life? And so this could be just your regular small group space. But you can get into in those spaces. And there's nothing wrong with this, but just maybe a slightly different way of thinking. But you can get into those spaces of like, we study the Bible, and then at least this is true with guys. I'm not exactly sure for girls, but like we study the Bible and then we like want to do accountability and prayer. And there's not really a space in there for just life, for like the real stuff that's going on. So we think in these kind of terms of like, we're learning about Jesus in the Bible, and then we're like talking about our sins and praying for each other. But we need to create an atmosphere and create literal space, like literal time, where it is normal and okay for teens just to talk about their normal life. The stuff, their relationship with their parents, or what's going on with school, or how they're feeling about their breakup that happened last week, or whatever it might be. And so we just have to like be intentional about creating the just doing life together part of ministry, not just the transactional, or transactional is not the right word, but not just the overtly Christian stuff, but just the life on life stuff too. I'm getting towards the end. Do you consistently follow up? I mentioned earlier, I was like the quintessential youth group kid. And when I finally opened up, I was met with grace and care, which was great. And that was like the last time my youth pastor talked to me about those things. And he didn't do anything necessarily wrong, but I do think he omitted the follow-up part of like checking back in to say, how are you doing with that? How have you made progress in that area? Because when you do that, it is transformational in the way that kids perceive your relationship, because what they said actually impacted you enough to remember to ask them about it later. And so when kids start opening up, and when things come to the surface, don't just let it go. And this takes effort, but do follow up. And then this gets into, which we can't dive into today for sake of time. When you're working with kids who are struggling with mental health, we started with some suicide statistics. Sometimes there does need to be like real hard, concrete follow-up of keeping kids safe, of connecting with parents, of potential hospitalization. We don't have time to go into all of those details today, but that's another piece, is if you feel like a teen is in danger in any way, then you have to follow up like immediately. All right. And then I think Marta mentioned this at the beginning of when we started talking about like what a safe place is, but do your students have a specific adult they connect with? It is not realistic in many contexts. I guess maybe in a smaller context, which is, I love small churches, so I love those contexts, but it is often not realistic for like one minister to be like the safe adult in every teen's life in the church. But the reality is like each teen in your ministry should have their person, which takes a lot of intentionality. And often you do that by like who gravitates to who naturally. But you can create at Treehouse, we call them care loads. It's kind of like a play on case loads that a social worker might have. But each adult, each volunteer has like 1 to 2 kids that are like their kids. And if that kid needs a ride to youth group, that's who they call to pick them up. And if that kid needs a ride home, that's who they call. And they build an intentional relationship so that when that kid is struggling, they know like I have my person. And they have an avenue for that openness and honesty rather than just carrying that, but they don't really know how to start a conversation, or they don't know how to break through like that relational barrier of like, I just don't know any adults very, very well here. All right, and then I think this might be the last one. We're getting there. Does your team have realistic expectations for teens? We can sometimes expect teens in our ministries to go from like A to Z very quickly. And especially if you're working with teens who are struggling with mental health or other issues, or if you're working with teens who are outside the church who are just coming to the Lord, the process, the growth cycle of a disciple is actually like really long. Like it's a lifelong journey. And so we sometimes may think incorrectly that we can just like put kids through a course or do a curriculum together and then they're like have spiritual growth. And so I do think it is important to recognize like if a kid was struggling with depressive thoughts 6 months ago, they're very likely going to be struggling with depressive thoughts today and in 6 months from now, and probably in a year from now as well. Because those things don't just like go away. And when we have unrealistic expectations, we can inadvertently shame teens to thinking that they should be in a place that they're not in, or that they're incapable of being in. So we do have to have like the long game mindset where we're walking with kids and we're reminding them of truth and we're praying for them and we're loving them and we're helping them to grow. It's just like that growth process can be just really, really challenging. And if we're going to create safe places, we have to be okay with that messiness that happens in the process. All right, that is all of the questions that we have. And I think we have a few minutes for questions if you would like to ask anything or discuss anything.
Yeah, you are welcome to hop off mute and ask questions or pop them in the chat while you're formulating your questions. I'm dropping 3 links in the chat. The first is just a survey on today's webinar. We always love your feedback, and we especially love ideas for topics that you want to see covered in the future. We don't want to put these on for questions you're not asking. So let us know what you want to see. The second is just a ton of resources from us. And then the third is a resource that you can give to your volunteers. It's Caring for Challenging Kids. A lot of times when kids are struggling and need a safe space, they have behavioral things that can be challenging. And if we mishandle that, we're not creating a safe space. And so if you used a code to join this one, use that same code and you'll get this one for free. Give it out to whoever you want to give it out to. We want your leaders equipped to handle that well. So if you have questions, I know I do, but I want you guys to go first. Nobody's chomping at the bit. Okay, my first question. As a leader, as we're creating these safe spaces and we have kids coming to us with struggles and we think about that care load, what are some tips for leaders to be able to carry that well and not just be overwhelmed with struggles of students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't want to give like the pat like self-care kinds of answers. But somebody that I respect in ministry told me a long time ago, a mindset shift that has been helpful. Also, I'm just I'm not like a naturally empathetic person. Like I don't feel what other people feel very easily. So this is a little easier for me than it is for others. But um they talked about a car accident. And if you imagine a car accident at night, and the emergency vehicles have come, how confusing that is from the ground level. There are people running, there is wreckage, there are people who are injured, and it can be a very confusing situation. Their suggestion was, from a mindset perspective, be the helicopter who is above the scenario, directing traffic, who's on the radio with the participants and uh, uh, creating guidance from outside the situation. And so from a mentality perspective, it is not wrong to create a barrier between you and the student's problem. That actually helps create safety, because you're keeping your own issues separate from theirs. This is something that is real for those of us who grew up like around mental health challenges or with some kind of shame or experience some kind of abuse. It is very easy for us to become triggered when we are working with these students. So it is actually like a really important skill to be able to create some of that separation. And some of the others is, and this is some of like the just self-care stuff is, um, intentionally trusting God with the students by unplugging completely at times. So like phone off, you are inaccessible. And you are going to use that as a act of obedience to the Lord, recognizing that He is all powerful and we are not. And I don't have to get myself confused thinking that I am the savior of these students, because I could never be the savior of these students. So that is like a really kind of concrete deal. This is a therapist just told me this a couple weeks ago, and I thought this was kind of a cool thing. She has a different pair of shoes that she wears at work than at home. And it is like a physical reminder of her. For her, is she is literally taking off her therapist shoes and putting on her home shoes, and then she uses that drive to like mentally leave everything at work. And she knows then I will pick that up again tomorrow when I put my therapist shoes back on. But right now, I'm just going to go home and be a mom. And I thought that was kind of a cool, just like a physical reminder of like creating a little bit of separation there.
Yeah, that is interesting. And it's an excuse to go get shoes if you like shoes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I love the car accident analogy too, because I think it's a helpful reminder as youth workers to stay in our lane. That if we try and be an EMT, we're probably going to do some damage because we're not trained to be an EMT.
Yes.
And so we can be in the helicopter and still provide a crucial support without, overstepping our training and what we've been equipped for. So I think that's a really helpful analogy.
Yeah, that's great.
Any other questions or thoughts as we wrap up?
I do have a question. How do you engage with a parent who doesn't necessarily, who isn't necessarily on board with exploring the mental health side of their son or daughter? So they just kind of want to drop their kid off, but you kind of need background, or you need some partnership with a parent, but they really don't want to get into that for whatever reason, shame reasons themselves, or whatever reason it is. What are some ways that you can engage with a parent that really doesn't want to be engaged with?
Yeah, that is really challenging. If anybody has any other thoughts, that would be open. The reality in every scenario is that you can never make somebody do something they don't want to do. And so if you're getting a brick wall, it may just be a brick wall. And so you may have to work inside that case where you're offering what you can to the students. I do think there is kind of a hard red line when the student is in a unsafe scenario, if they may be suicidal, then you have no choice, and the parents really have no choice. Because then if it is a dire situation, there are circumstances where you actually have to circumvent students because it's the law, or circumvent parents because it's the law to create, to keep a kid safe. But that would probably be a somewhat rare scenario. But if anybody has any other thoughts on helping parents engage when they don't want to engage, I'd be open to that.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is trust building and just being faithful in how you show up for that parent and building that sense of trust. For a lot of families, they insulate these things because they're protecting their kids. There's a shame element. There's, whatever is going on. But the more that we can just be trustworthy people in their lives, I think the better. Right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you will check out the Caring for Challenging Kids and other resources available. And I would really appreciate it if you take just 2 minutes and fill out just some feedback on today. We are taking a break from our monthly webinars, but we have so much coming out this summer, so many resources and conversations and things like that dropping. And so the best ways to make sure you're not missing that is to check our emails. We will send all of them right to you. You just have to open it. And follow us on social media, on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, whatever you're on. We would love to be able to get all these resources into your hands so you can pass them on to whoever it's helpful to, and we can all come alongside teens better. Ash, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the work that you do. And at Treehouse, it's just incredible work. And we are just delighted to partner with you and help end hopelessness among teens. It's just a great mission. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Yeah.